First start by base coating any exposed facial areas and hands with Bugman's Glow. Some riders have their faces more exposed, so make sure you're thorough when applying this base coat and try and catch every bit of exposed flesh. Next, layer the flesh with Cadian flesh tone. Take care to pick out individual fingers over the hands and create natural depth, as well as paying attention to raised areas across any facial details. Finally, pick out the uppermost areas of skin with Kislev flesh. This gives a very natural and weather-worn look to the riders, whilst also maintaining a consistent hue throughout. Focus this on knuckle joints, fingertips, tendons down the back of the hands, and if the face is exposed, then the bridge of the nose, eyebrows, cheekbones, and jawline. Base coat the hair and beard with Steel Legion Drab. Layer over all the hair with a 50-50 mix of Zamesi Desert and Steel Legion Drab. This will bring a degree of richness to the Rohirrim's hair and mirror the natural blonde sported by most of the kinsmen of Rohan. Add some pallid witch flesh to the previous mix and start trying to pick out individual hairs across the head and any facial hair they may have. This will allow the wash stage to create natural depth and flow more efficiently, as we'd have already mapped out our highlighted areas. Continue to add more pallid witch flesh to the mix for the next few highlight stages. At each stage, try and make each highlight more precise and targeted to allow the previous layers showing through underneath. Focus a bit more on the curves and tips of the hair to further push the natural flowing look we want to achieve. Base coat the Rohirrim's cloak and shield with a 60-40 mix of Castellan green and dryad bark. This will create a more earthy green base for the future highlight stages and will prevent these areas from becoming luminous during the later layering and highlighted stages. To push the natural earthy look further, add a small amount of the messy desert to the previous mix. This will bring up the tone more naturally and also bring a degree of richness. Start focusing more on some of the upper areas of the cloak, leaving the darker green mix showing in the deepest recesses. It's at this stage we decided to remove our poor Rohirrim from his paperclip perch and set him on the horse for further painting, as we felt this would give us more stability and control for painting stages later on. With the shield, draw the paint vertically in thick lines to create the base for the wood panelling effect. Add more of the messy desert to the mix to further bring up the tone of the green mix. Now you want to focus on highlighting the upper folds of the cloak to make a more natural flow as the wind rips through the material, as well as drawing it down in thinner lines either side of the previously marked out wood grain effect on the shield. Finally, add some padded witch flesh to the mix and apply a fine edge highlight to the upper and outermost folds of the cloak, as well as an extremely fine edge highlight vertically down the shield to finish off the wood panelling effect. The addition of padded witch here will just make the green mix pop a little bit more and accentuate where light will be hitting the rider as he gallops off the wall. Base coat the armour, including the folds, chainmail and spear tips with lead belcher. Edge highlight all the armour and metalwork with rune-hang steel. Some of the Rohirrim models sport scale mail as shown here, so to create the best effect, try and pick out the edges of each scale. This is a time-consuming process, but the results are definitely worth the effort. The riders of Rohan wear a multitude of different shades of browns, leathers being a predominant feature of their kin. We're going to try and create some differentiation with them all here to keep the model visually interesting once it's finished. Base coat the spear shaft, boots, forearm sleeve, belts and bow with dryad bark. Edge highlight these brown areas with Gorthor brown. To create the wood effect on the spear, carefully draw the tip of your brush down the length of the shaft in random vertical streaks. Try and maintain a good tip on your brush to avoid making any unnecessary splodges over already finished areas. We want to create a more rich leathery brown for some areas of the rider to contrast against the previous stage. Paint the inner shin guards, saddle and inner areas of the helmet with a mix of Doomball brown and Abaddon black. Add some Tuscarl fur to the previous mix for the first layer. Bisect the shin pads down the centre and layer this mix on the half facing out to create some natural shadow against the horse's body. With the saddle and inner helmet, focus again more on the upper areas where the light would naturally hit. Finally, apply a fine edge highlight of pure Tuscarl fur over these areas to further push the definition. Base coat all the gold areas, including the inner shield, helmet and full trim, and shin guard trim, with Retributor armour. Once the wash is dry, add Runefang steel and edge highlight the upper areas to get the impression of reflection off the metal as the light hits. Finally, apply a dot highlight of pure Runefang steel just to fully accentuate the lightest points of shine and reflection. Base coat the underrobes around the rider's legs as well as the upper arm sleeves with Rhinox hide. Highlight these areas now with Gorthor brown. Although simple, the Rhinox hide will provide a noticeable contrast to the other brown areas we have already painted using Dryad bark as a base. Base coat the shield decal with Rakarth flesh. Make sure you water this down sufficiently and apply in a few thin coats to avoid a clumpy finish. Be extremely careful here also to avoid getting Rakarth over the green wood effect we have already finished. Once the wash is dry, layer over again with Rakarth's flesh, making sure to leave the Agrax earth shade showing in the separations around the symbol. Now, with a fine detail brush, carefully trace a fine edge highlight around the entire symbol. You don't need to worry about being too neat here, as any mistakes can always be touched up with more Rakarth flesh, but try to avoid this and take your time, as repeated mistakes will result in an uneven looking painted area. Finally, paint the quiver on the back of the rider with storm vermin fur. Once the wash is dry, apply an edge highlight over the material with Dawnstone just to create some definition. Horses can be painted in a variety of different colours to create a varied look amongst your models. In this video we're going to focus on a rich brown thoroughbred horse, most commonly seen in Middle-earth, and we'll go through other horse paint schemes in future videos. To get the rich brown base we want for the horse's body, apply a base coat with a 50-50 mix of dryad bark and Mournfang brown. The dryad bark just helps to tone the Mournfang down ever so slightly and give it a bit more of an earthy, realistic look. Once the wash is dry, add some Gorthal brown to the previous mix for the first layer. Here you want to focus on layering up some of the musculature over the entire horse, leaving the agraq showing in the deepest recesses. Pick out big separate areas of muscle to block out with this stage, such as the rump, neck, and creating some definition around the legs. Add some more Gorthal brown to the previous mix for the first highlight stage. Now you want to push the muscle definition further by focusing on the outer and upper areas of muscle across the horse's body. This doesn't need to be amazingly neat, but the more careful you are here, the more effective the final highlight will be overall. Make sure you try to follow the flow of the muscle across the body and apply paint only where it's needed to create a realistic, moving animal effect overall. Finally, edge highlight over the previous highlight with Gorthor Brown. At this stage, you may want to apply a glaze of some areas with Agrax Earthshade just to further push the definition of muscle and tie the layers together a bit more, but we didn't feel on this occasion that it was a necessary addition. The horse's armour was painted the same as the Rohirrim's to tie the two models together a bit when they're assembled. Paint all the straps and reins over the horse with drier bark. Make sure you don't miss the straps on the underbelly. Then, edge highlight all these straps carefully with Gorthor Brown. Paint the areas just above the hooves with Rakoth flesh to give the horse his socks. Once dry, layer over with a mix of Rakoth flesh and pallid witch flesh, leaving the inner recesses of muscle still showing the Rakoth. Carefully pick out the horse's tongue with tusk or fur. Give the horse's mane and tail a very light dry brush with storm vermin fur, just to pick out the definition of the hair. Try and be as careful and targeted as possible here to avoid clipping the flesh. Touch up the hooves with Abaddon Black just to clean up any paint that may have clipped them during the painting process. At this point, you can also paint the black of the horse's eyes, and once dry, pick out the pupil by adding 2 small dots of pallid witch flesh either side of each. The teeth were painted with Rakoth flesh and then carefully highlighted with dots of pallid witch flesh. The saddle can be painted however you wish. We opted for a brown hair ourselves, but as the Rohan warrior will be astride his mighty steed, this area won't be seen, but some colour should still be applied just to avoid those nasty unpainted spots. Finally, we gave the cloth under the saddle a highlight with storm vermin fur, just to add a point of interest to where the rider will be seated. Again, this can be any colour you wish. We chose storm vermin fur as we felt it tied in with our model more. And there you have it, the first Rohan rider, ready to storm across the plains and wreak havoc with horse, axe and spear alike.